Landscapes as archives of exiles, migration and formation of ingredients. Landscaping as the horizon of the fluid archive.
During the last 40, 50 years, the urbanization of Palestine is driven by a form of conquest of territory. What we are witnessing is a form of very rapid urbanization of cities in order to preserve them from being expropriated. So we're witnessing in large cities such as Ramallah or Nablus or Hebron a form of conquest of territory. The buildings are more looking as objects that do not really speak to each other and do not depend on a form of master plan or any formalization of territorial configurations. And this is as well impacts the form of the use of materials in architecture and how the material has an impact on the form and the territorial aspect of architecture. Today, more than ever, the way architecture is represented in Palestine is linked to the object itself and no more this relationship to nature. Historically, the Palestinian city has been configured around the idea of nature, where we used to have the very dense nucleus and very dense city centers, and the way to preserve nature that is a predominant element of the formalizations of Palestinian cities, is being disrupted. Historically, the way city centers spoke to the landscapes were basically creating a very high density city centers while preserving the nature, and preserving nature was achieved by maintaining it free from any form of architecture and construction. Today this relationship is being disrupted because there's a need of urbanizing the cities and densify the cities from one end, and from another end, in order to preserve these landscapes and preserve them from being expropriated by the occupation, architecture is being used as a tool to mark property and to be certain that these territories are being preserved by forms of architecture.
Various views of looking at modernity, what it is, and how it is manifested in Palestine. One of the major issues talking about urban modernity is the relationship between Ottoman modernity and colonial modernity, which came after the war, when Palestine became part of the British Mandate. And people at the time assumed that before the British came, the Ottomans were some kind of agetic mode of control that is backward, did not do anything. But now, with the new interest in critical modernist ideas, we know that there was a major battles going on in the late Ottoman period to modernize the state, to revamp it, to create a legal system from the Tanzimat, which would face the competition from Europe and prevent the Europeans from eating the country. In Palestine, which was the victim of segmentation after the war, when the colonial powers came and divided it, there was an important modernist enterprise going on in the coastal region. And we can see that in Haifa, in Jaffa, and to some extent in places like Gaza, which were commercially connected with the global system through Europe, the cash crops and the buildings and the presence of ethnic minorities, some of whom were Europeans, some like the Greeks and the Italians were from close by shores, introduced systems of building and a lifestyle which contrasted very much with the traditional forms of social organization in the highlands, which is Jerusalem, Nablus, Hebron.
I think this evolution of the city, this evolution of the architecture in the city is also very much linked to the materials used in the city and to the evolution of the use of the material, predominantly stone and concrete, let's say in the most recent times, but the stone as a material that was used first as a structural material, as a climatic material, and the forms of the city were linked to the use of the material, so the architecture is linked to the shapes that can be built out of stone, since it's a structural material, and the evolution of the material from being a structural material to a cladding material has transformed the morphology of the city, bearing in mind that this use of material is superimposed with historical events that are more political, cultural, environmental, that have constituted an environment for the use of the material that is completely different. So this, more specifically, this law on the use of the material put in place in Jerusalem by the British Mandate in 1918 has been now expanded to most Palestinian cities, where the use of stone is, every building has to be built out of stone, and in the beginning of the century it was structural stone, now it's clad stone. And the use of clad stone, although it's a global trend, let's say, or a global transformation in architecture, but here in Palestine it is linked with political reclaim of territories. So clad stone is linked to something that is in relation with territory. So there is this scales of the use of material that are linked to the urbanization of the city, to the growth of the city. The limits of the city are not really defined because of occupation and because of territorial reclaims. The borders of the city are being developed in a very, let's say, in a way that has nothing to do with architectural references of historical Palestinian cities that are very typological. So the Palestinian city is very typological and not iconic. It is made out of typological spaces that can adapt, transform, be modified in several ways, and in that sense they're very, very contemporary or very modern, because they're not iconic. They can be very much used in very different ways, in very different programs, in very different modes of living, and so in that sense they're very contemporary. But in contemporary architecture of Palestinian cities, those typologies are being disregarded. There are new vocabulary of an architecture that is based on consumption of material.
أول اشتغلت فراشة بعدين صرت أتعلم جفصين ديكورات. حاليا بمجال شغلي هذا في البلد. لا أنا بفضل هان. في الداخل بهدلة، بذلوك بلقمة عيشك، بذلوك من محسوم على الساعة 4 الصبح تطلع تروح على الساعة 7 في الليل، بتحط راسك وبتنام ثاني يوم على الشغل. لا بتشوف أولادك ولا بتشوف مرتك ولا بتشوف حدا. مظبوط، معاشات بيغروا الناس معاشات أغلى. أيوة.
A lot of these buildings that were constructed using the traditional materials like the mud and even the clay roofs and stuff, they were destroyed.
While living with Siham and her family in Jericho, I organized a public intervention called Crossing Jericho. It was a nocturnal walk from the mountains, from the Ein Duke spring, through the town of Jericho out into the desert, ending at the derelict school of ADS. 72 people, local people, joined, and we spent half the night uniting in that empty school building and exchanging the experience on walking through Palestinian territory and ending in a place like this. Most people consume the dairy products of ADS but didn't have a clue where it is nor what it is.
Palestine as a country and Palestinian Authority as a product of the Madrid Peace Conference and the Oslo Agreement came out with no institutional bureaucratic systems of archiving. We inherited the Ottoman archives like Sijil al-Nufus, which is the population registry, and especially the sigil of the Ottoman Islamic courts, plus the Christian ecclesiastical courts also, which have an extremely rich archive, which we began digitizing mid-1980s. So this is a very important patrimony from the past. But the authority itself started with very moderate but important, useful archiving system, especially with the Bureau of Census. With the Statistical Bureau, the National Statistical Bureau, established the procedures and protocols for monitoring and recording and making available extremely detailed facets of economic and social life.
During the establishment of the State of Israel, which is the Nakba to us, a lot of refugees and a lot of martyrs were created, so he thought of bringing them into the Arab Development Society and look after them, teach them, established also a dairy plant, agricultural farms as well, and a school, you know, for training in ironmongery and carpentry and so on.
Discovering the ADS linked so much to my ongoing research about sustainable ways of living and working. I'd been looking at this for the last 10 years in urban and rural spaces, and I'm always driven by that question if it's possible to live a sustainable life in the 21st century. And if so, how is this set up?
Here you see this general view of the farm with these small houses, which are more white and flush surfaces, more modern, even more modern in the sense they were structured around this central space. We see more of a structural grid system that divides the farm into two parts. So to the western part, you find more of the houses, the cafeteria, some of the barracks here, and then you have a central swimming pool, and you have his house, a school, and another housing which was built in 1956. It's a semicircular house. This sort of layout is more of the private. Of course, it's a modernist grid with flush white surfaces for the buildings. The only building that you see in stone is the school or the training center. Each had a garden, which was well kept by the kids who lived farm.
Musa was more ambitious, not in political terms, but in bringing in major reform to the rural center. And one of the things he did was to establish a model farm in Jericho called the Arab Development society with major Arab support.
Musa Alami initially envisioned the Arab Development Society to safeguard Arab lands in Palestine and ensure the welfare of rural Palestinians, raise the standard of living for the villagers, أو الفلاحين, both economically, culturally, and socially. This is another brochure which says it's a miracle in the Holy Land, and you will see in so many people writing like Cecile Hurani talking about how this farm was one of its kind in the Arab world in the early 50s of the past century. And also here, as I was talking more about, the structured life of and habits of the students. And here's like King Hussein visiting the site with Musa Alami.
He was politically active, but his interest was in meeting the challenges of the segmentation of Palestine, its separation from the Arab world, and of course the debacle of the 1948 war. His farm started before that, and he was trying to bring modernist farming techniques to a region which was very fertile but neglected, which is the Jordan Valley. And then the war happened, and Jericho was flooded with refugees. So he turned his project to help the refugees being steadfast to withstand the onslaught of the war. And the Arab Development Project became a place for absorbing Palestinian refugees from the inland area, which became Israel, into the Jordan Valley, and Jericho in particular. In the 50s and 60s, he was attacked severely because of these projects that he introduced to refugees. But he withstood, and he was able to stand it despite the amazing opposition against him, and his project became very successful in economic terms. Although politically it was never survived as a project to rehabilitate the conditions of life of refugees.
The many other species which did not become domesticated, at least as far as we know, what could provide the basis for new crops sometime in the future. And because we're losing this biodiversity quickly due to urban expansion, the spread of agriculture over more and more areas, and also urbanization in terms of both Palestinian urbanization and settlement expansion. Here in Palestine, we are trying to document and collect these species so that there will be the possibility of working with them in the future.